All right, buckle up, everyone, because we're diving deep into a topic that's close to home for many of us, literally, tenant rights in California.
Yeah, it can be a bit of a maze to navigate.
Exactly. Between leases, landlords, and legalese, it's easy to feel lost. That's why we're here to break it all down, make it clear, and empower you with the knowledge you need.
That's right. We've got legal guides, FAQs, and even insights from some seasoned tenant rights attorneys.
And to make things even more real, we've got a workshop from actual tenant advocates.
We're talking a 360-degree view of your rights as a tenant in California.
And let me tell you something that really stood out to me from all this info. Even if your lease tries to slip in something about waiving your rights, it's not legally enforceable.
That's a good point. California takes tenant protections seriously.
That's reassuring to know. So with all this info, where do we even begin?
Well, I think a good place to start is with the concept of habitability.
Okay, habitability. I think most people would assume that means having a roof over their heads and working plumbing.
Right, but it goes way beyond that. California law gets into the nitty-gritty of what makes a living space truly habitable.
So paint me a picture. What kind of issues are we talking about?
Imagine this: leaky windows, persistent mold problems, ventilation so poor you're practically living in a sauna.
Oh, wow. I wouldn't thought those issues could be considered legal violations.
They absolutely can be. California Civil Code Section 1941 lays out a whole bunch of requirements, from waterproofing and weatherproofing to things like adequate trash receptacles.
Really? Trash receptacles?
Yep, and even a minimum amount of natural light.
It's a lot more comprehensive than I realized. But let's say you're in a situation where your landlord just isn't addressing these issues. What steps can you take?
First and foremost, document everything. Always notify your landlord in writing about any habitability issues.
Okay, so we're talking email, good old-fashioned letter.
Exactly. This creates a clear paper trail and protects you down the line.
Got it. But what if the landlord still doesn't budge?
Well, if that happens, you've got a few options. One is the repair and deduct remedy.
Repair and deduct.
Yep. Under certain circumstances, you can actually hire a licensed professional to make the necessary repairs yourself and deduct the cost from your rent.
So you're basically becoming your own handyman.
In a way, yes, but there are some important rules. You have to give the landlord reasonable notice and a chance to fix it themselves.
Makes sense.
And the amount you can deduct is capped, usually at 1 month's rent.
Right, so it's not a free-for-all fix-it spree.
Right. Now, what if the issues are really severe or the repair and deduct option isn't feasible?
What then?
In extreme cases where the place is truly unlivable due to these habitability issues, you might have the right to actually vacate the premises and break the lease.
Wow, I didn't know that was an option.
It is. It's obviously a last resort, but it's important to know you're not trapped in an unsafe or unhealthy living situation.
Absolutely. Are there any other avenues to hold landlords accountable for neglecting these responsibilities?
Definitely. You can always contact your local housing authority or code enforcement agency.
Right.
They can come in, inspect the property, and if the landlord isn't meeting those habitability standards, they can issue citations.
And I'm guessing those citations come with some hefty fines.
You bet. Sometimes the city can even impose additional penalties.
So it's not just about fixing the immediate problem, it's about ensuring landlords maintain safe and habitable housing for everyone.
Exactly. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that can be a huge source of stress for renters: eviction.
Eviction. I feel like just hearing that word makes my heart race a little.
Right, but here's the thing. In California, you can't just be evicted on a whim. There has to be a valid legal reason.
Okay, so let's break that down. What constitutes a just cause eviction in California?
Well, some common reasons are non-payment of rent, violating the terms of your lease, things like having unauthorized pets, subletting without permission, that kind of thing.
Those seem pretty straightforward. But what about situations where a landlord might be trying to get rid of a tenant for less legitimate reasons?
Like they just don't like you personally, or you asked for a repair?
Exactly.
Well, that's where California's tenant protections really come into play. Statewide laws like AB 1482, which is also known as the Tenant Protection Act of 2019.
Okay, AB 1482.
It requires just cause for eviction in most cases.
So a landlord can't just decide they're tired of you and kick you out.
Nope. AB 1482 significantly limits the reasons a landlord can evict a tenant, which gives renters a lot more stability and security.
That's good to hear. Are there any other protections that renters should know about?
Absolutely. A lot of cities and counties have their own local ordinances that give even stronger tenant protections. For example, in Los Angeles, there's the Rent Stabilization Ordinance, or RSO as it's often called.
We RSO.
It provides additional safeguards specifically for tenants living in rent-controlled units.
So depending on where you live in California, you might have multiple layers of protection against unfair eviction practices.
That's right. But it's important to remember that these laws and ordinances can be a bit complex. It's always a good idea to familiarize yourself with the specific rules that apply in your area.
Good advice. Okay, we've covered habitability and eviction, two really important aspects of California tenant law. But now I want to talk about those situations where things get a little more personal. Let's talk about harassment and retaliation.
Yes, those are serious issues. And thankfully, California law offers clear protections for tenants who experience them.
Okay, good. So let's start with harassment. What exactly constitutes illegal landlord harassment?
Okay, picture this. A landlord who's constantly showing up unannounced at your door, making threats, trying to intimidate you into leaving.
Yikes, that sounds awful.
Or maybe they deliberately withhold essential services like hot water or heat, or they make unreasonable demands. All of these actions are considered harassment under California law, and they can have serious consequences for the landlord.
So it's really about creating a hostile environment, infringing on your right to peace and quiet enjoyment of your home.
Exactly. And then there's retaliation, which is equally troubling. This happens when a landlord takes action against a tenant because the tenant asserted their rights.
Like reporting a habitability issue or joining a tenant union.
Precisely. California law says landlords cannot retaliate against tenants for exercising their legal rights.
That makes sense.
And get this, there's a 180-day grace period where retaliation is actually presumed, which makes it easier for tenants to prove their case.
180 days. That's quite a window of protection.
It is. So what happens to landlords who engage in harassment or retaliation?
Yeah, what are the consequences?
Well, they can be held liable for actual damages. This means things like covering your moving costs or the difference in rent if you have to relocate because of their actions.
Okay, that seems fair.
But it goes even further. They can also face something called punitive damages.
Punitive damages.
These are specifically designed to punish the landlord and deter them from doing it again in the future.
How much are we talking about here?
Punitive damages can be up to $2,000 per violation.
Wow. That's a serious financial incentive to behave.
Right. And on top of that, they could also be ordered to pay your attorney's fees.
Oh, wow. So that makes it less risky for tenants to actually pursue legal action.
Exactly. It levels the playing field a bit.
Okay, that's a lot to take in. It's great to know that California law is on the side of the tenant, but I imagine it can still feel intimidating to stand up to a landlord, especially when you're dealing with all this legal stuff.
Absolutely. These situations can be really challenging, but the good news is you don't have to go through it alone. That's where tenant rights attorneys come in.
Okay, tenant rights attorneys. They sound like the superheroes of the rental world. But let's be realistic. Can everyone afford to hire a lawyer?
That's a valid concern, but there are resources out there to make legal help more accessible. A lot of tenant rights attorneys offer free consultations just to assess your situation and talk about your options.
That's good to know.
And some even work on a contingency basis.
Contingency basis.
That means they only get paid if they win your case. So no upfront costs, you only pay if they're successful.
That takes a lot of the financial pressure off.
It does. And even if you're not sure whether you need a lawyer, that initial consultation can be so valuable just for guidance and peace of mind.
Okay, so we've covered habitability, eviction, harassment, retaliation, and the importance of getting legal help when you need it. But to really do a deep dive into tenant rights, we need to explore all those resources out there in more detail.
Absolutely. There's a wealth of information and support available to tenants, from online guides and hotlines to local organizations and those law firms that specialize in tenant advocacy.
Well, I'm ready to dive into that next.
So let's say you're facing a tenant-landlord issue and you're feeling a bit lost. What's the first step you should take?
Well, I'm hoping it's not challenge them to a duel, though that would make for a pretty entertaining story.
Yeah, maybe not the most effective strategy. The first step is really to arm yourself with knowledge. And thankfully, there are some amazing organizations out there that specialize in tenant rights advocacy.
Oh, right. Like who?
One that kept coming up in our research is the Housing Rights Center.
The Housing Rights Center. Okay, tell me more about them.
Well, they're a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting fair housing practices. Think of them as a one-stop shop for tenants who are looking for information, advice, and even legal support.
That sounds incredibly valuable, especially if you're navigating these issues for the first time.
Exactly. They offer a wide range of services, from educational workshops to counseling sessions, and they can even provide legal representation in some cases.
Oh, and here's the best part. A lot of their services are completely free.
Free legal help. That's huge, especially for tenants who might not have the financial resources to hire a lawyer on their own. Absolutely. They also have a really comprehensive website. You can find sample letters to communicate with your landlord, guides that break down those complicated legal concepts in plain English, and they even have a tenant hotline you can call to speak with a counselor.
So it's a great place to start, even if you're just trying to understand your basic rights or get some initial advice.
Exactly. Now, let's say your situation requires a bit more hands-on legal help. That's when you might want to consider contacting a tenant rights attorney.
Okay, a tenant rights attorney. Makes sense. Are there any specific firms or attorneys that we came across in our research that stand out?
A few names kept popping up. One is Tobner Ravenscroft LLP.
Kobiner Ravenscroft, LLP.
They seem to have a really strong track record of representing tenants in a whole variety of cases, from habitability issues to wrongful evictions.
What makes them a good choice for tenants specifically?
Well, they have a reputation for being pretty aggressive advocates for their clients' rights. They're known for being thorough, for really knowing California tenant law inside and out, and for their commitment to, fighting for justice.
That sounds promising. Any other firms that got your attention?
Another one is the law firm for Tenant Rights, Inc. They seem to focus specifically on representing tenants who are facing eviction or who've been victims of landlord harassment or retaliation.
So they're the specialists you call in when things get really tough or when you feel like your rights have been seriously violated.
Exactly. They really have a passion for helping those tenants who are most vulnerable to unfair housing practices, and they're not afraid to take on those challenging cases.
That's reassuring. Are there any other resources that tenants should be aware of?
Yeah, actually, there's one more I want to highlight. It's the Martinez Law Center, based in Santa Ana. They serve tenants across several counties: Orange, Riverside, San Diego, and Los Angeles.
Okay, the Martinez Law Center.
Their website specifically mentions expertise in eviction defense, unlawful detainer cases, and even personal injury issues that can sometimes come up within a tenant-landlord relationship.
So they've got a pretty broad range of services for tenants facing all sorts of legal challenges. It's amazing to know that there are so many options for legal help out there. But I imagine going to court can be a daunting prospect for a lot of people. Is that the only option when you hire a lawyer?
Not at all. In a lot of cases, simply having a lawyer send a strongly worded letter to the landlord can be enough to resolve the issue. Landlords are much more likely to take things seriously when they know there's legal representation involved.
So it's not always about litigation. Sometimes it's just about having that leverage and showing that you're serious about protecting your rights.
Exactly. That's why that initial consultation with an attorney is so valuable. It gives you a chance to explain your situation, get expert advice, and explore all those options before you decide on a course of action.
Right, makes sense. Now, we've talked a lot about seeking legal help when needed, but I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier: documentation. It sounds like it's crucial whether you're dealing with a habitability issue, an eviction notice, or any kind of harassment from your landlord.
Documentation is key. Think of it as building your legal safety net. It's your way to prove what happened, when it happened, and who was involved.
Okay, so what should tenants be documenting specifically? Is it as simple as keeping a copy of your lease agreement?
Well, your lease is definitely important, but you should also document all communication with your landlord. Emails, text messages, phone calls, even handwritten notes keep a record of everything, especially when you're reporting a problem or experiencing harassment.
So if it's not in writing, it basically didn't happen.
Pretty much. And even if you do have a verbal agreement with your landlord, it's always a good idea to follow up with written confirmation. Summarize what you discussed and what was agreed upon.
Okay, I'm starting to see the value of that paper trail. But with all these documents flying around, how do you keep everything organized and accessible?
A simple folder or binder can work wonders. Just label everything clearly and organize it by date or by topic. And remember, technology is your friend.
Yes.
Scan those documents, store them securely in the cloud. That way you have access to them anytime, anywhere.
That's a great tip. It's amazing how digital tools can simplify things and get rid of those bulky file cabinets. Speaking of technology, is it legal to record conversations with your landlord in California? Like, if you're having a phone call, can you record that for your records?
California is what's called a two-party consent state. That means both people involved need to agree to the recording, so no sneaky recordings. But if you're having an important conversation, you can always just let your landlord know that you're recording it for your records.
Right, transparency is key. And if they object, you can always just follow up with a written summary of the conversation, making sure you've got a record of what was discussed.
Exactly. It's all about covering your bases and protecting yourself.
Okay, so we've talked about individual rights, legal resources, the importance of documentation. But I think there's another dimension to tenant advocacy that we haven't touched on yet. The power of collective action. Our sources mention tenant unions, but they don't go into much detail. There's a whole other deep dive waiting to happen.
I agree. Knowing your individual rights is super important, but there's also strength in numbers. When tenants come together and advocate for change, they can have a much bigger impact on the housing landscape.
So let's shift gears a bit and explore that world of tenant unions and collective action. What's it all about? How can they empower renters in California? Okay, let's unpack this whole tenant union idea. I get the general concept, but I'm a little fuzzy on the specifics. What exactly are tenant unions and how do they work?
Think of it like this. A bunch of renters come together, pool their resources, share their knowledge, and create a much stronger voice when it comes to housing issues. That's a tenant union in a nutshell. It's all about solidarity, amplifying the power of individual tenants.
So it's kind of like a support group, but with a mission to actually shake things up in the rental world.
That's a great way to put it. Tenant unions create a space for renters to connect, share their experiences, and figure out how to tackle common problems together. They also educate tenants about their rights and, give them the tools to actually do something about it.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture. But what kind of doing something are we talking about? What are some of the goals that tenant unions typically go after?
Think about things like pushing for rent control policies, advocating for stronger habitability standards, challenging those unfair eviction practices we talked about earlier. Those are all things that tenant unions fight for. They're working towards a more balanced and just housing system.
So they're not just dealing with individual problems. They're going after the bigger systemic issues that create those problems in the first place.
Exactly. They're trying to shift the power dynamics in the rental market, make sure tenants have a real shot at safe, affordable housing.
That's a powerful idea. But how do they actually make it happen? What are their strategies?
Well, one of their key tactics is collective bargaining. When tenants are united under a union, they have a lot more leverage when they're negotiating with landlords or property management companies.
So it's about turning those individual voices into a collective roar that landlords can't ignore.
That's it. They also do a lot of advocacy work, lobbying for tenant-friendly policies at the local, state, even national level. And sometimes they might even take legal action to challenge unfair practices or discriminatory housing policies.
So they're covering all the bases. But I'm curious, how effective are tenant unions in California? Have they had any wins we should know about?
Oh, they've actually been instrumental in pushing for a lot of the tenant protections we have today. Remember AB 1482, the Tenant Protection Act?
Yeah, the one we talked about earlier.
That landmark legislation was a direct result of years of advocacy by tenant unions and housing rights groups. They really fought hard for that one.
Wow, so they're not just talk, they're action. They're actually making a tangible difference in the lives of California renters. That's pretty inspiring.
It is, and their impact goes beyond just legislative wins. They also offer direct support and resources to individual tenants who are facing eviction or harassment. They help them navigate the legal system, know their rights, and stand up for themselves.
Okay, I'm sold. How does someone join this renters revolution? Are there specific tenant unions in different cities or regions?
Definitely. A lot of cities and neighborhoods have their own local tenant unions. Usually you can find them online just by searching tenant union plus your city or region. And if you can't find a local group, there are statewide organizations like Tenants Together that offer resources and support if you want to organize.
So there are options for getting involved at both the local and state level. That's great. But let's be realistic. Joining a tenant union might not be feasible for everyone. Some people are already juggling busy lives, or they might be hesitant to get involved in activism.
You're right, it does take a certain level of commitment. But even if you can't join a union, there are still ways to support their work and contribute to the cause of tenant rights.
Like donating to their cause or spreading the word about their efforts.
Exactly. Every little bit helps. You can also attend their meetings or events, volunteer your time, or even just stay informed about the issues they're fighting for. Even small actions can make a big difference when it comes to creating a more just housing system.
While feeling a lot more empowered as a renter in California after this deep dive into tenant rights and the power of collective action, it's amazing to realize how much support is out there and what we can achieve when we stand together.
That's exactly what we were hoping for. We want you to feel empowered with knowledge, connected to those resources, and inspired to take action. Remember, you have rights and you have a voice.
To wrap things up for our listeners, you're not alone in this. There are so many resources out there, from legal aid organizations to tenant rights attorneys to those tenant unions fighting for your rights. Document everything, communicate clearly with your landlord, and don't hesitate to reach out for help if you need it.
And if you're looking for more information about tenant rights, or you want to explore your legal options, remember the Martinez Law Center is a great resource. You can find them online at martinezlawcenter.com. They specialize in representing tenants, and they're passionate about fighting for your rights.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into California tenant rights. Remember, knowledge is power, and together we can create a fairer and more equitable housing landscape for everyone.
Stay informed, stay empowered, and know your rights.
Call now 714-442-9741. Thank you.